Thank you to the Soho Forum. Thank you to Matt, who found some nice quotes of mine questioning especially whether the virus emerged from the Wuhan seafood market. I think it's interesting that that quote was from 2020, 4 years ago. As it so happens, over the last 4 years, I've been involved in much of the primary research on this, and my view has changed as we've done that research. I certainly agree I'd be in a bad position if Matt had pulled out a quote from last week where I said that. But before I kind of go into the evidence that I'll present to you describing the origin of this virus in the Wuhan seafood market and tackling a few of the points that Matt made, let me tell you a story about an emergence of a novel virus. It's late fall, November, early December in China. All of a sudden, in wild animal markets, there's an emergence of a new respiratory virus causing pneumonia of an unknown cause. This virus turns out to be something that we now call a SARS-related coronavirus. At the time, had not been known before. It turns out this virus is, or virus closely related to this virus is found some months later in animals like civets, raccoon dogs, ferret badgers. And it turns out when we find the closest bat virus to where this virus emerged in wildlife market in a city of 10 million people, that those caves are over 1,000 kilometers away. And there's no trace at the time of infections in the supply chain in the rural areas between those caves and the market. This did not occur in 2019, not the exact story that I'm telling, but in 2002. But it sounds very much like what happened in 2019. And so while I certainly agree with Matt that saying epidemics in the past have been zoonotic, not from a lab, doesn't hold much value if you're talking about an era before molecular biology. Historical parallels and coincidence are important. Matt brought up many examples of historical parallels and coincidence and asked you to take them seriously. And that is a hell of a historical parallel. The emergence of SARS-1 in 2002, the emergence of SARS-2 in 2019 were very, very similar to each other. And that's because they most likely emerged in very, very similar ways. What I'm not here to do, and Matt talked a lot about lab leaks happen. Lab leaks could cause a pandemic. Some of the research that was done was viewed by some as risky. It was not done under the highest biosafety conditions as are often done in the United States. But the question here tonight, the question at issue in this debate isn't whether a lab leak could cause a pandemic. It's whether this specific pandemic was caused by a lab leak. The pandemic SARS-CoV-2, which has tragically killed over 20 million people. And I completely agree the public deserves answers on how it started, accountability. That's part of why I'm here. And that's also part of why I have been involved in the primary research trying to understand the origin of this virus. So let me tell you what I've learned. And we'll go from where the virus started outside the market on our way in. And so it's true that all of the December 2019 cases cluster generally around the Wuhan seafood market. And Matt mentioned this is due to ascertainment bias. It's because you looked for cases with a connection to the market. But of those roughly 160 cases, over 100 of them had no epidemiological link to the market. And when you identify the center of those cases, they are even more closely linked to the market from a geographic standpoint than the cases that are epidemiologically linked to the market, telling us that not only were there infections at the market, people who shopped there, people who worked there, people who lived with people who worked there, but almost certainly that there was community transmission in the neighborhood around the market in Wuhan in December 2019. And there is no other place in Wuhan with any evidence of community transmission. When the Chinese government, as asked by the WHO, went back and looked at 40,000 blood samples collected between September and December 2019, in the beginning of December, they found not a single positive case, a single case of SARS-CoV-2 infection occurring before December. I think we all know, and the science tells us probably started in late November. but no evidence of transmission anywhere else in Wuhan aside from the neighborhood immediately surrounding the Huanan seafood market before December 2019. If the first infection occurred in a lab, it went almost immediately to the market. Could happen, but let's use our common sense. What was going on inside the market? Matt mentioned that when there was environmental sampling inside the market, they found that a hotspot of virus positivity in the market was in a particular place, the southwest corner of the market. That's true. He also said that that was where live animals were sold. That's also true, and we'll talk about exactly what live animals were sold and the historical parallels. But he said that the reason that that hotspot was in that southwest corner where the animals were sold, and by the way, it's not the only place in the market that the animals were sold. There were also sales on the northwest corner and on the east side of the market that were not hotspots, was because they focused intensively their sampling there. That's actually not really true. There were several sampling trips to the market. The biggest one was on January 1st, and they actually mostly sampled stalls associated with human cases. And in those stalls, they found virus, and they found genetic material mostly from humans, because that virus had been deposited by people. On January 12th, they went back, and they did deliberately target 7 stalls in the market known to be selling wildlife. Mind you, a year later, they told the WHO there were no live mammal sales in the market. So when Matt says, I'm going to tell you that they were covering up things related to the market, that's because there's evidence that they lied to the World Health Organization about that. And I'm a little confused, Matt, about when I'm supposed to believe the Chinese government and when I'm not. Because the reason in April 2020 that I said I wasn't convinced that the pandemic started in the market was because George Gao, the head of China CDC, said it didn't start there. So on that, I should believe him. But when the same Chinese government says it didn't start in the lab, that's when they're lying. I'm going to go with, let's be agnostic about what the Chinese government says, and let's look at the data. When we looked at the genetic content of those samples in the southwest corner of the market at a particular stall that sold live mammals and was actually fined for doing so illegally, believe it or not, in October 2019, we found that in that hotspot of virus positivity, there was an incredible enrichment of genetic material from animals like civets and raccoon dogs, the exact animals I told you that were associated with the emergence of SARS-1 in 2002. Another clear historical parallel. None of these data prove that that virus was deposited by animals, but there were no known human cases associated with those stalls, unlike virtually all the other positive stalls that they swabbed. And human genetic material wasn't enriched there, as it was in many of the samples where human cases were known to be associated. So if we're going with that kind of association across the market where known human case, a lot of human DNA, in this case, no known human case, a lot of raccoon dog, a lot of civet DNA, I think it's quite possible, likely, if we're going to believe that humans deposited the virus with their DNA, that animals deposited the virus that's associated with their DNA. Does it prove those animals were infected? Of course not. But from a genetic standpoint, from the standpoint of a DNA trace, this is exactly what we would expect in the aftermath of a zoonotic event at that site. And let's talk a little bit about what the genomics of the virus tell us as well. There were 2 lineages of SARS-CoV-2 circulating in Wuhan by December 2019. Matt noted this. They're similar. And both were found in the market. This was actually a conundrum, a difficult problem for research pointing to an emergence from the animal trade for some time, because at one point only lineage B had been known to be found in the market. And it's true that lineage A is more like the animal ancestor viruses. But we found in our work that lineage A cases in December 2019 were very close to the market. And it was actually the Chinese government itself who recently published data showing that lineage A was present as well on a glove sample. That's true. There's no human case known to be associated with that stall, although an early draft of a WHO case map from the WHO Origins report did show a suspected case there. We've tried to find out whether that was ever confirmed or not, and we haven't been able to. But we have tried, and that's an example of, myself and some of my colleagues have been actively involved in this research, trying to inform all of you and the wider public what happened, hardly trying to cover anything up. There's a problem with those two lineages, though, in that A looks older, but based on the number of, A looks older from the standpoint of it's more similar to the bat viruses, but B, from the standpoint of the number of mutations that it had accumulated over the course of December, January, February, appears to be older in terms of its circulation in the human population. How does that happen? That happens if the virus that is a little bit more different than the ancestor actually started circulating in humans first. We call this a discrepancy in the molecular clock. Viruses mutate at a very regular rate, like the hands ticking on a clock, and that allows us to date the time of their emergence. And lineage B looks older. What does that mean? It means almost certainly that lineage A and lineage B diverged not in humans, but in animals, and that each entered the human population individually. Now, some will tell you multiple spillovers, it's crazy, what are the chances? I can tell you that there's research from wild animal markets in Laos that a single civet has 7 human interactions per hour. So in an 8-hour day, one infected civet in a live animal market has over 50 opportunities to infect a human being. Infecting more than one doesn't seem very hard to me in that case. And the truth is, a single initial infection of SARS-CoV-2 is pretty unlikely to cause a pandemic. We're all familiar with the idea of super spreading, and the reason that we know about that is because the reason that's driven the pandemic is because most infections with SARS-CoV-2, that person doesn't infect anyone else. 80% of the transmission is done by 10 to 20% of the cases. So if one person gets infected in the lab, what are the chances that that leads to a pandemic? Not likely, which is the question we're dealing with here tonight. So to turn to a few of the points Matt made, we spent a fair amount of time talking about this blueprint, inserting a furin cleavage site. I don't have one on my chest either, although I don't have a shirt to prove it. That grant proposed to identify naturally occurring furin cleavage sites in samples collected from bat swabs, and then to take those naturally occurring sites, which they predicted to occur at low abundance because they think they're rare in bat viruses, which I agree with, Matt, and then insert those into viruses that don't have them and see how the furin cleavage site changes the behavior of the virus. Absolutely true on that point. But if furin cleavage sites are uniformly absent in natural viruses, they never would have found one. And they wouldn't have introduced it, I guess. A lot of the other work Matt described, the very troublesome work, in his views, incredibly risky, the lab program most likely in the world to cause a pandemic. I've read the report from that forum. It doesn't say that. I think that that's because the forum was held under Chatham House rules, which makes it easy to say something that was said with no accountability for who said it. But most of that work was conducted using viruses closely related to SARS-1. Matt didn't tell you that. He left it out. None of their work, published, unpublished, deals with experiments before the pandemic, deals with experiments touching a virus related to SARS-2. And the US government itself, in its intelligence assessments, has said repeatedly that they have no information that the Wuhan Institute of Virology held a virus before the pandemic close enough to SARS-CoV-2 to be its progenitor. And I think, Matt, we would likely agree that if they didn't, the pandemic certainly did not start there, where we differ on whether they might have. But if they didn't, it's an absolute prerequisite for the pandemic starting in the lab. And even the US government, with its vast intelligence resources, has said there's no evidence of that. Finally, and I'll close here, I'll talk about the suspicious behavior of the Chinese government, a lack of transparency. Like I said, none of the work that I've been involved in or anything I'm telling you here depends on the believing the Chinese government, which I think is a more consistent position than people who will depend on the word of George Gao. The Chinese government acts suspiciously. US government officials have said this. It has no evidentiary value. They lied about the market. They have not been transparent about what went on in the lab. They have not been transparent probably about how many people died in Wuhan. So if they are just not transparent, if they lie across the board, let's set that aside. Let's set what this person did and what this person did aside. And let's talk about the scientific data, and let's think about the scientific data. Where the pandemic started, in Wuhan. Where in Wuhan? In the neighborhood around the market. Where in the market? In the stall selling the most wildlife, the most live mammals in the entire city of Wuhan, and the exact species of live mammal that sparked the SARS-1 epidemic in 2002 and 2003. We talk about coincidences with respect to the virus emerging near the leading coronavirus lab in the world. I probably was a little ahead of myself. I should have said it was Ralph Barrick's lab, and they were number 2. That's a coincidence to pay attention to. Not a lab 10 miles away, but the animal market, the animal stall, with the right animals at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.